Towards the tail end of the 3DS's life, Game Freak once again decided to stick with what they knew. Instead of developing a Pokemon game for the upcoming Nintendo Switch, they made another 3DS game, Generation 7's Pokemon Sun and Pokemon Moon. Yeah, the launch of Gen 7 felt a lot like the launch of Gen 5, another generation on a system that housed the previous one. There isn't anything wrong with this, but these generations released so close to the launches of the then upcoming Nintendo systems that everyone kinda wished they would have put the new generation on those upcoming systems. And this time around, the further for a Pokemon game on the upcoming system was even more intense, as that upcoming system was the Nintendo Switch, a console handheld hybrid. People were dying to see a mainline Pokemon game on a home console, and this could have been the time for that. But it wasn't, as 2016's Pokemon Sun and Moon released for the 3DS. The year is 2017 and it is finally time for us to get a Pokemon game on the Nintendo Switch. Oh, come on! Game Freak did it again. 8 months into the Switch's life, the latest Pokemon games Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon released for the 3DS. They made a massive deal about the reveal of these games too. So much so that I thought for the longest time that these games were sequels to Sun and Moon, just like Black 2 and White 2 were. It wasn't until months after the game's reveal and I was having a casual conversation with someone about Pokemon that they corrected me. And I like to think that I'm very much in the loop on current gaming news. These weren't sequels. For the first time since 2008's Platinum, Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon were merely the enhanced editions of Sun and Moon. Well, regardless of the weird messaging around the enhanced editions, we have the 7th generation of Pokemon games. So let's talk about them. The parallels between Gen 5 and Gen 7 run deeper than being the 2nd generation on its given system. The Gen 6 games Pokemon X and Y were a big leap forward for the series, showing what a Pokemon game could look like in 3D. Gen 7 had to be a bit more then, to impress those who had already experienced those games, and like Black and White, Sun and Moon looked to the story and characters to wow its fans. X and Y's story was rather basic and left a lot to be desired. The story in the Gen 7 games is anything but basic. The games begin unlike any Pokemon game. After the new Professor Kukui introduces us to the region of Alola, it doesn't cut straight to the awakening of our player character. Instead, we are immediately hit with a scene of the major supporting character, Lily, being chased through a strange science fiction-esque facility, concluding with a mysterious silhouette of a Pokemon unleashing its power. It's an exciting opening that sets the stage for a different kind of Pokemon story. One without an evil corporation hell-bent on world domination, world altering, world creating, or any of that jazz. Instead, it deals a lot with family drama as well as loss and grief. Some characters weren't as strong as others in their past, and we get to see what that means for them in the present. Team Skull are this game's Team Rocket, Team Flare, or what have you, but they are nothing like those organisations. They're just a group of punk kids, and I think the fact that they are kids is the main differentiator here. Whereas all the past teams consisted of adults who thought they knew better, the kids in Team Skull don't really feel like they know better. They're just rebelling against the card that was dealt to them by society. They are bad guys, but they aren't necessarily evil. Not only does this make them a breath of fresh air, but it makes them more entertaining to interact with. This also goes for the team leader, Guzma, who despite being the leader is basically on the same level as his cronies. Team Skull are my favourite quote unquote evil team in a Pokemon game, and I think they're handled beautifully. The story isn't devoid of a corrupt organisation, but I don't really want to reveal who that is or show any footage of them because it is a bit of a spoiler. The reveals of who the organisation are and why the leader is doing what they are doing is pretty cool and ties in well with the rest of the plot up to that point. The characters close to the player character are vital to guiding the player through their journey. In fact, a large chunk of the narrative revolves around Lily, the character from the beginning. You serve as her bodyguard throughout the bulk of the game, but she really is the one guiding you, as she always seems to be several steps ahead of you at all times, which could be seen as a weakness of the game's waypoint system, but we'll get to that in due time. Back to Lily, she's a likeable and determined character with a clear devotion to her Pokemon friend Nebby, and seeing what happens to them throughout the story is enjoyable. Many of the characters we meet along the way are also great, like Gladion and Lusamine. Both of these characters also have some nice arcs, but we won't get too into it because of spoilers. I like our rival in this game, Hal, although he most certainly borrows a lot of his personality from the friendly rivals of old, especially Barry. But Hal definitely wins the award of the happiest rival in the series. He could even compete for the happiest character in any video game ever. I'm certain some people might find him annoying for this reason, but I think his personality fits the happy-go-lucky vibe of the Alolan region. It seems that everyone loves the Alolan region, as there are multiple cameos from important characters from past games. They don't have a direct impact on the story, but it's nice to see them show up. Plus, the Gen 7 games have more humour than past Pokemon games. The writers were more playful with the script this time around, and there are some cutscenes that actually had me laughing a few times. Jokes with Hal often end up coming off at his expense, but he just laughs it off. Gee, what a nice guy. A lot of the humour is also supplied by Professor Kukui, who is perhaps the most lovable professor. The differences between Sun and Moon and their Ultra variants is a little complicated. They of course added some stuff, but they also made some major alterations, some of which I'm not sure were for the better. The differences arrive as immediately as the opening cutscene, the one with Lily, where she now also bumps into the Ultra Recon squad. This new organisation travelled to Alola in regards to the threat of Necrozma. Basically, they're a way to tie the third legendary of Gen 7 into the story, kind of what Platinum did with Giratina. This bit is all well and good and doesn't change a whole lot. Other cutscenes will change near the beginning of the game, which changes the order of some things, including how the player obtains their first Pokemon. Again, nothing too major. However, it's around the middle of the game and towards the end where massive story alterations take place, actively changing the way a player would perceive some of the characters, specifically Lusamine and Guzma. But even Hal and Kukui were affected. Some cutscenes and battles have been thrown out entirely and replaced with new ones. In my opinion, this was not a good way to handle this. As someone who had played the original Sun and Moon, my thoughts and feelings towards these characters were already formed by the actions of them and the events described in those games. Now with the Ultra games, I just have to throw all that out and replace it with this alternate take of these characters. I am not a fan of this approach at all. My favourite moment from Sun and Moon was cut. So for all the areas in which Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon improve, they'll always contain this weird story divergence. It's a real shame. But back to a more positive note. The 6 generations of Pokemon games before Sun and Moon always gave the player the same objective, the gym challenge. I suppose the devs were employing the if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality to the max. But Gen 7 dared to be different. Gyms were out, and in its place, we got the Island Challenge. The Pokemon games don't change a whole lot from game to game, but Gen 7 actually broke tradition. Instead of travelling from town to town facing off against the 8 gym leaders, players instead take part in trials scattered throughout the islands. Now don't get too excited, even though they are named something different, the trials end up playing out very similarly to gyms, where a puzzle has to be solved in order to reach the boss, though the bosses themselves are the key difference here. Instead of taking on a gym leader, the trials bosses are totem Pokemon. These are larger Pokemon with buffed stats, who are able to utilise the new SOS mechanic and call in partner Pokemon. They're not too dissimilar to other battles, but they at least offer something different to the norm that we've grown accustomed to through the many previous games. I don't necessarily prefer the Island Challenge to traditional gyms, they're probably on the same level, but I do like that the devs changed it up this time around. And some are genuinely a lot of fun, like Kiawe's trial and Acerola's trial. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon shook things up by altering some of the trials with new totem Pokemon to fight, and even added in an exclusive trial, which is nice. For those people who may miss the traditional gym battles, they're kinda here too in the form of the Grand Trials. There are only 4 of these, but it gives the player an opportunity to take on some of the stronger trainers introduced earlier in that part of the story, the Kahunas, who themselves are excellent characters with quirky personalities that receive as much love from the writers as the rest of the cast did. In fact, so did the many trial captains. Although you don't battle most of these captains during their trial, they still manage to be more memorable than many of the past gym leaders. It's similar to how the Gen 5 games incorporate the gym leaders into other parts of the story, and it's done just as well here in my opinion. But here's where a major criticism of the Gen 7 games may come into play, the notion that there are too many cutscenes. Yes, it's true, these games do have a lot of cutscenes with a lot of dialogue. It feels worse than other games because a majority of the story is told in literal cutscenes, whereas a lot of previous games' story unfolded in dialogue that took place in the world itself, without the fade to black transitions. Personally, I don't find this to be too much of an issue. A good amount of cutscenes introduce new characters and story elements and serve a purpose. Without them, I don't think the story would be as good or the characters as memorable. However, I do agree that a certain amount of cutscenes could have been scrapped. There are too many devoted to Hal and Lily that don't add a whole lot. But to be honest, I think the real issue isn't so much to do with the amount of cutscenes, it's more to do with the progression formula. Generation 7 was the first one to introduce waypoints. Throughout almost the entire game, it is very clear exactly where you have to go to move the story forward. Most areas that aren't marked with a waypoint are gated off in obvious ways, forcing the player to follow the path that the game has set out for them. What happens when you get to the waypoint? Cutscene. Next one, cutscene. The one after that, cutscene. When all you want to do is explore the wonderful resort destination of Alola that the devs have created, you have to do it at their pace, not your own. Pokemon games have been very linear for a long time now, and most older games actually worked similarly to how the Gen 7 games do, but it wasn't so blatantly obvious. You didn't know exactly where the next checkpoint was, so you weren't always anticipating a cutscene. The Gen 7 games literally show you exactly how the game is paced. I guess the only thing to predict is whether the cutscene will be one of the good ones, or if it's just another boring chat with Hal or Lily. Obtrusive hand-holding in Nintendo games hit its peak during the Wii and early 3DS era. I'm surprised these late 3DS games shoved in so much of it. It's not just the waypoints, but the first 2 hours or so is like one big unskippable tutorial. Thankfully, the very opening of the games is strong enough that hopefully most players will push through the slog of the tutorial to get to the better parts of the games. With all this additional time that players will spend looking at the characters, I have to say that I am most thankful that this game's presentation is a massive step up from Gen 6. When I first heard that Pokemon was going 3D, this is what I had envisioned. The high quality character models that we see in the opening cutscene are basically what we see throughout the rest of the game. Granted, they are lower detailed in most other areas, but they still retain the same overall design. I could never get behind the more chibi looking human characters in the Gen 6 games, and thankfully we don't have any of that in these ones. Not only do they look great, but they also have way more nuanced animation in cutscenes, which is one thing that allowed these games to add more humour, as a lot of it comes off thanks to the expressive reactions. The one downside to this is that it makes the player character's unchanging goofy smile stand out way more, and a little creepy that that's their reaction to absolutely everything that is happening, good or bad. Dude, your Pokemon are about to be stolen by Team Skull. Stop smiling! Trainers also appear in battles now alongside their Pokemon, and even use balls other than Pokeballs, ones that are chosen to match their personality or skill level. As a long-time fan of the series, this is one element that I adored. It's not just the characters, but the way the world is presented is also exactly what I thought a 3D Pokemon game would be like. It's a fully 3D world where top-down camera and tile-based movement is no more. There is still no camera control, but the camera angles and distance are chosen depending on how to best display the scene. In my Gen 6 video, I said that the battles showcase some of the best visuals on the 3DS. For the Gen 7 games, the same sentiment is there, but for the entire game, not just battles. I can't really think of any 3DS game that comes close to matching the visual fidelity of Pokemon Sun, Moon, Ultra Sun, and Ultra Moon, except maybe Resident Evil Revelations. It should be noted that these games have absolutely zero stereoscopic 3D integration, not even in battles. Sorry if you cared about that. Unfortunately, all this graphical goodness most certainly comes at a price. That price is the performance, especially when playing on an original 3DS or 2DS, which is what I used to capture the footage that you're seeing here. Most cutscenes are fine, but the frame rate can take a hit in some, even ones that seem like there isn't a whole lot going on. It's in the battles where we start to see the 3DS hardware take a beating. The worst cases I've found were in the Totem Pokemon battles and double battles with weather effects. Not only does the frame rate see a massive decrease, but the whole game slows to a crawl. After selecting a move, it takes the game a few seconds to figure out what the hell is going on. It's atrocious, and it's obvious that the development effort was focused on making the game work as well as it could on new 3DS systems. And on those systems, there are some drop frames here and there when there are a lot of models on screen in battles, but it's not too bad. And to be honest, this is a turn-based RPG, so although some battles run poorly on the old hardware, it's not game-breaking by any means. The visuals were not the only major step up from Gen 6. The soundtrack in these games absolutely slaps. Again, this is another area in which Gen 7 compares to Gen 5. At this point, saying that Gen 7 has one of the best soundtracks in the series almost has no meaning, as I've said it for like 3 different generations, and most of the Pokemon games have excellent soundtracks, but Gen 7's music is fantastical, right up there with Gen 2 and 5. Gen 6 had some great tunes, but was held back by some average overworld themes. These games definitely picked up the slack in this regard. The overworld themes cover many different genres and use a ton of different instruments, giving them their own flair that makes for a soundtrack that is constantly surprising the player. Tracks like Vast Pony Canyon, Mali City Day, and Hau'oli City Day are wonderfully cheerful tracks that complement the Hawaiian-inspired region of Alola. Oh that's right, returning from the Gen 4 games are the alternate tracks that play depending on the time of day. Love that. Then there are the battle themes, and my god, there are so many good ones. Team Skull Battle, Guzma's battle theme, Gladion's battle theme, Elite Four battle, and a few others that I don't want to mention because of spoilers, but they're all so good. Then they added even more awesome tracks in the Ultra games. Even if you don't feel like playing the games, go check out the soundtracks. In terms of the battles, it feels like Game Freak looked at everything new that they added in Gen 6 and were like, yeah, let's change all of that. In place of Horde battles, there were SOS battles. A selection of Pokemon can call a partner into battle with them, creating a 2-on-1 situation. And like Horde battles, occasionally a rare Pokemon of a different species can show up. I think I prefer SOS battles to Horde battles as it's less tedious to deal with 2 Pokemon rather than 5. What I don't like about SOS battles is that a Pokemon calls for a partner after they've taken their turn, meaning you can end up in a situation where you take out one Pokemon only for the other to call yet another partner to the battlefield. This can be frustrating. Thankfully, the amount that this can happen seems to have been toned down in the Ultra games. Remember the major new addition to Gen 6, Mega Evolution? Yeah, apparently Game Freak weren't huge fans of that because they completely tossed it aside for the new Z moves. Mega Evolutions are in the game, but they're hidden away in the post game. Z moves, or as they're likely pronounced in the Alolan region, Z moves, are beefed up attacks that can be used by any Pokemon, but can only be used once per battle. I may be in the majority on this, but I prefer Z moves to Mega Evolutions. The fact that every Pokemon can take advantage of them is a big plus for me, and since single player battles are so short anyway, they end up accomplishing the same thing as Mega Evolutions without the need for a transformation. Plus, the animations for some of the signature Z moves are really cool. The quest for gathering the Z crystals is also so much better than gathering Megastones in X and Y. The Z crystals feel like this game's badges, but they have a practical purpose that can immediately be taken advantage of. But if you do prefer Mega Evolution to Z moves, at least they didn't get rid of it entirely. Sun and Moon also introduced a new battle format, Battle Royale. I'm not really too hot on this battle format. A 100 mon free-for-all Pokemon fight would be awesome, but that's not what this is. It's only a 4 mon free-for-all, in which the trainer is scored based on how well they performed. Having a scoring system in a Pokemon battle doesn't really do it for me. There was one major quality of life improvement implemented into the battles. After defeating a certain Pokemon species once, the Pokemon's type data will be registered and displayed on the touchscreen with the touch of a button. Doing this will show stat changes and all moves will show their effectiveness. Some people may feel that this is streamlining the game a little too much, but after 20 years of Pokemon, I still forget the effectiveness of some types on others. Now I don't have to look it up or look up what type a particular Pokemon is. This is a great addition in my eyes. The removal of gyms were not the only lost tradition, but HMs are now gone too. This is good news. HMs were a fun way to interact with the world, but they also cost valuable move slots on your Pokemon. The HMs were replaced with rideable Pokemon, which serve a very similar purpose. Tauros can smash through rocks, Lapras can swim, Charizard can fly, and so on and so forth. There's nothing bad I can say about this. Some rideable Pokemon did feel like they were just padding out the numbers, like Mudsdale and Sharpedo, but that's nothing anyone can really complain about. The little bit of off the beaten path exploring that you're allowed to do in these games usually comes in the form of backtracking after acquiring a certain rideable Pokemon. But for those looking to complete the story, the world of Alola is basically a straight line. The path does wrap around on itself at some points, but that's only really to come back to a roadblock that has moved so that players can proceed along the linear path. The linear nature of the game somewhat betrays the multi-island layout of Alola. When travelling to a new island, it's only possible to explore selective chunks of it at a time, which is a shame. Since the different islands are segregated, it would have been nice to have free reign to explore, but be confined by the constraints of said island until the story lets the player progress to the next one. Alas, that was not how they did it. For that reason, the multi-island layout feels a bit pointless and ends up making the individual islands feel small and squashed. But the places that you visit along the way are quite good, especially the different towns. There are less than 10 towns this time around, but they all have unique scenery and fitting music. It's too bad the names are hard to pronounce, so I'd be able to tell you some of my favourites. Po Town, that's an easy one. There's a surprising lack of dungeon-like areas in Alola. It's mostly made up of towns, short routes, and a few mountainous ranges, with a dark meadow or jungle here or there. The lack of dungeons isn't necessarily a bad thing. It fits the theme and makes Alola feel rather unique. I can praise Alola in that it has a lot of character, especially in the Ultra versions where you can see different Pokemon wandering about in the scenery. The people of Alola also help give it character. Many of those just standing around waiting to battle at least have some animation and do more than stand there. Although I didn't find the layout of Alola to be all that great, the places that you visit and the lively and cheerful people that inhabit Alola make it a pretty good region overall. Alola brought with it a bunch of new Pokemon, but as well as that, it also brought with it brand new Alolan forms of 18 Pokemon that originated in Kanto. Regional forms are something that I love. It reminds me of what I liked about Mega Evolutions, completely new versions of Pokemon that we know and love, some of which are very weird. And when it comes to this sort of thing, I can't get enough of the weird. Give me more weird. Alolan forms have entirely new types and different moves that they can learn. For all intents and purposes, they could be treated like new Pokemon. Something that I loathe about Gen 7's introduction of new forms is that it is limited to Kanto Pokemon only, for no real reason. I mean, sure, they try to justify it in the story, but they could have removed this reasoning and explored ways to shake up Pokemon from all generations. I know why they did it. I said in my Gen 1 video that the original 151 are the most iconic. Everyone has their own opinion about which Pokemon look good or bad, but the first generation is always seen as the most iconic. But Pokemon has a rich history that they could have pulled from. Limiting the Alolan forms to Kanto Pokemon made it more boring than it could have been. There's even an Alolan Professor Oak, for Christ's sake. Don't get me wrong, I still really like their inclusion, I just would have liked it more if they had pulled from the other generations as well as the first. As for the brand new Alola Pokemon, it's a great set. Even with the new forms of old Pokemon, Sun and Moon managed to add even more new Pokemon than X and Y did. The ones that stood out to me the most in this generation were the Ultra Beasts. Ultra Beasts are basically Pokemon from a different dimension, and because of that they look weird. Like so weird that they don't really resemble Pokemon at all, but something entirely different. But because they come from a different dimension, their weird designs are justified. And like I said, I love the weird, and I love how crazy these guys are. Gen 7 was also the first time that Pokemon were added in after the fact. In the past, some Pokemon weren't accessible until an event would take place in real life, but they would always be somewhere buried in the code. This time around, Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon added in a couple Gen 7 Pokemon that didn't exist prior, one of them being Poipole. I like this approach and hope that this is a precedent that continues should they release more enhanced editions in future generations. Unfortunately, the Gen 7 games didn't contain the same giant amount of previous Pokemon as X and Y did. It's not a small amount by any means. Sun and Moon's Alola Pokédex has 300 Pokemon, and Ultra Sun and Moon added in a further 100. At 400 Pokemon, that only falls short of X and Y's Kalos Dex by around 50, which doesn't sound like a lot, and it really isn't. However, they aren't dispersed as densely as they were in X and Y. There are fewer Pokemon per route, making it so that there is less reason to hang around the route for a long time collecting new Pokemon, like you could in X and Y. Added to this, the pool of Pokemon that you have to use in your party throughout the story is a lot smaller. This may just be a me issue, but this is an area in which I vastly prefer Gen 6. Granted, it might not be a good idea to rotate your party in the Gen 7 games anyway, as the difficulty is a step up from Gen 6. The levels of the opponent's Pokemon rise quicker in these games, likely as a direct result of complaints that the Gen 6 games were too easy. That's just Sun and Moon. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon are more difficult than those even, with some fights being genuinely challenging. Most notably the fights with Guzma and some in the late game. I didn't mind that X and Y were easy, but if you did, the Gen 7 games pretty much clear that up entirely. To be honest, when collecting the Pokemon as I go, I'm not really looking for great battle teams, I mainly just like to fill the Pokédex. That is by far my favourite activity in the Pokemon games, and Gen 7 did add some cool features in this regard. The Pokédex now has pages for each evolutionary line, allowing players to track whether a Pokemon evolves or not, or if they have a pre-evolution. Not only is this helpful, but it just looks nice, showcasing the Pokemon in different 3D poses. While we're on the topic of the Pokédex, there is one major feature that is completely absent, the National Dex. When I first found that out, it was a huge disappointment. All the Pokemon are still in the game's code. Any Pokemon can be brought over from Pokemon Bank or Pokétransporter, just like it was in Gen 6. In fact, Pokemon from the Game Boy Virtual Console games can even be brought in. Yet there is no space in the Pokédex for them. I'm sure most people won't care about this, but for me, this was a big bummer. In Pokemon Diamond and Pokemon X, I had a lot of fun importing my Pokemon from older games and evolving or breeding them to add them to the Pokédex. That aspect is just gone in the Gen 7 games. All you have to do is collect the ones in Alola and you're done. All past games had both a regional dex and a national dex, so if you only wanted to go for the regional dex, the option was there. In Gen 7, it's the only option. Not sure why they did this, but I hate that they did. In any case, there is at least now something to do with the Pokemon in your box. The Poképelago is a facility where players' box Pokemon will hang out. Here they can level up, gain happiness, grow berries, among other things. This is a cool feature as it allows the Pokemon not in your party to serve more of a purpose, and to grow on their own while you're off fighting Team Skull or something. Or if you don't want to send a Pokemon to your box and would rather put them straight into your party, you can now do so. Not only does this make for added convenience, but now makes heal balls a tiny bit more useful. A new method for finding Pokemon this time around is the Island Scan, a feature paired with the QR scanner. Yep, we're in experimental territory once again. The main purpose of the QR scanner is for players to scan QR codes found in the Pokedex of other players' games. This will give the first player that particular Pokemon's scene data for the Pokedex, aiding them in finding and capturing said Pokemon. It's definitely an interesting feature, like most of Pokemon's experiments are, but in the age of the internet where every Pokemon's location is right at our fingertips, this feature is kinda pointless. Performing enough QR scans will unlock Island Scan, which allows players to scout out rare Pokemon that aren't available in the Alola Dex. I like the idea of Island Scan, it kind of reminds me of the Poke Radar from the Gen 4 games. The difference here though is that the QR scanner has limited uses and will recharge over time. So you would have to bug a friend every day to scan their 3DS, or you could just internet. The Gen 7 games even have another game hidden away inside, Pokemon Snap 2. Well, that's what we all wished for anyway. The Poke Finder is a way to take pictures of one specific Pokemon at different locations. It's a cute inclusion I guess, but if it was as deep as Pokemon Snap, then that would automatically shoot Gen 7 to the top of the Pokemon generation tier list. But sadly it was not to be. The amount of Pokemon available was not the only regression coming from Gen 6. The online features are vastly inferior. The whole PSS thing is gone, and it's no longer possible to interact with any player at any time. The Festival Plaza is the new hub for multiplayer. On top of that, it's the new destination for things like the lottery, EV training, and collecting a bunch of different items. But collecting the coins to do so and raising your rank is just boring. There's a mission system reminiscent to Gen 5's Entralink, but most of the missions here are also boring. Connecting online will make all these random guests appear, and it's supposed to increase interactivity with other players worldwide. But they all act like personalityless NPCs, which made me feel more disconnected from other players. And even if you ignore these features and only use Festival Plaza as a means to battle or trade with friends online, getting that set up is more complicated than it was in Gen 6. Those games nailed online Pokemon. The Gen 7 games shouldn't have changed that. The Festival Plaza is a tad better in the Ultra games simply for the fact that it has a couple additions to it. The Battle Agency is a fun new mode in which players use Pokemon borrowed from others to take on trainers Battle Tower style. This mode actually has some story relevance, one that demonstrates another split from the original Sun and Moon. Episode Rainbow Rocket is an added scenario and the main piece of story content in the post-game of Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. This completely replaces Sun and Moon's additional story scenario involving Looker, Annabelle and the Ultra Beasts. I like both of these. I probably like Episode Rainbow Rocket more as it's a longer, more impactful piece of content, bringing back a ton of characters from prior games. I just don't like that it completely replaces the post-game story content of the originals. And that's something that really irks me about the 7th generation games. Because there is so much altered in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, it's no wonder that I thought these games were sequels when they were initially revealed. But different doesn't always equal better. As some parts of the story, it isn't better, just different. So you end up with a different experience depending on which one you play. Which sucks because I can't deny how much additional content there are in the Ultra games. More Pokemon, more characters, added minigames including Mantine surfing, the Battle Agency, some awesome cinematic moments towards the end, added challenge and great new fights. But because of all of the changes, it's hard to say that they are the definitive experience. Whereas for Crystal, Emerald and Platinum, it was very easy to say that they were. And the Ultra games have this annoying talking Rotom with no off switch, so it's actually the worst game ever made. I can't recommend playing through both games because they are so similar in most areas that there really isn't much point. If you haven't played the original Sun and Moon, I suppose you don't really know what you're missing, so I guess I'd say play Ultra Sun or Ultra Moon, maybe? At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter which one you decide to play. You don't really need to have the quote unquote definitive experience to have a fun time with the 7th generation. Whichever one you play, it'll be a good game. In many areas, the Gen 7 games greatly improve on the Gen 6 games that preceded them, with the story and visuals in particular. They probably are better games, but I don't know if I can say that I prefer them personally. The lack of a true national dex is a big reason for this, but I'm not here to rank the generations, and looking at the Gen 7 games in a vacuum, they are solid. Check them out if you haven't already. Alright, next up are the big boys, Generation 8's Sword and Shield. Subscribe if you want to see my video on those, and I do hope you've been enjoying playing them. Anyway, that's it from me for now. Thanks for watching, and have fun playing video games.